Today we are taking a look at cases with unexpected and surprising twists. You just may think they are from a movie script rather than in real life, but each and every one of them is 100% true. Our first case is shocking and complicated with more twists than you will ever see coming. This is not a typical story of a murderer. It is more than just one tragedy. As a teenager, Sharon Marshall appeared to have the whole world open to her. She was reportedly a lieutenant colonel in the ROTC and one of the best and brightest students in her class. An undeniable, intelligent young woman with a kind heart to match. Upon graduating from high school in 1986 from Forest Park, Georgia, Sharon had earned a full-ride scholarship to the Georgia Institute of Technology, with the plan of studying aerospace engineering so that she could fulfill her dreaming of working at NASA. Despite this incredible opportunity, Sharon never went to college as she was harboring a secret. Sharon was pregnant during the final months of high school by her boyfriend, who she never told about the baby. Sharon hid her secret well, and she ended up giving birth and allowing a wealthy couple from Texas to adopt the baby boy. However, the pregnancy had shaken up her life. At one point, she apparently even tried unsuccessfully to run away with her boyfriend. After losing her chance to attend college, Sharon ended up moving to Tampa, Florida, for a new start with a man named Franklin Delano Floyd. Despite having moved with Frank, Sharon started to date another man, and she was soon pregnant for a second time. She once again never told the baby father about the pregnancy. This time, however, she chose to keep the child and raise it with Frank. Sharon gave birth to her son Michael Marshall in 1988. Frank and Sharon had a complicated relationship. It wasn't quite clear if it was romantic or not, but the two lived together and both provided for Sharon's son Michael. Frank worked as a painter, but he frequently suffered from a bad back, and so he was rarely able to actually work. Because of this, Sharon became an exotic dancer to provide for them, but they also began to rely on welfare checks to survive. Her co-workers thought of Sharon as a kind and friendly, but she was especially close to an 80-year-old co-worker named Cheryl Commesso. Despite the woman's friendship, Frank and Cheryl were known to have frequently disagreements, though there were reports that the two of them may have been involved in a brief relationship. On a weekend in 1989, Frank, Sharon, and Cheryl went on a boating trip together, where a fight broke out between Cheryl and Frank. Following the argument, Cheryl allegedly reported Sharon to social services for misrepresenting her true income as an exotic dancer. Sharon had been hiding some of the money she made to still get checks from the government, but Cheryl claimed that Sharon no longer qualified for welfare aid. Enraged by Cheryl's action, Frank went to the club where Sharon and Cheryl both worked and confronted her just outside business. Witnesses reportedly that Frank actually punched Cheryl in the face during the argument. Shortly after, Cheryl left her father's house to travel to stay with a friend, but when she never called her dad to tell him that she had arrived safely, he reported her missing. Her abandoned Corvette was discovered at the airport, and investigation ensured to find the missing woman. Both Frank and Sharon were seen as a person of interest, but for years, no evidence ever arose to connect them to Cheryl's disappearance. The two quickly packed up and left the area, which only increased suspicion, especially since they started using different names as they traveled. Frank and Sharon ended up getting married in 1989, and Frank claimed it was to give Sharon's son his family name to belong to. Though the couple frequently went by different aliases, they ended up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Sharon once again working as an exotic dancer. Sharon easily made friends everywhere the couple went, but no one seems to like Frank as he aggressive and unpleasant. Reportedly, Frank once said got into fight with another dancer Sharon worked with, and when the woman yelled at Sharon that Sharon should leave him. "If she ever left me, I would kill you." Little did Frank know Sharon was making plans to leave him for a man she had met at the club where she worked. Allegedly, Sharon would have left Frank earlier, but she was afraid of what he would do to her and her son Michael. Before she was ever able to leave though, Sharon was the victim of a sudden accident. She was found unconscious by a highway and it appeared as though she had been the victim of a hit and run. Frank claimed that he was asleep at the time of the accident. Though rushed to hospital, Sharon never regained consciousness. Her friend from the club would come to visit her, where she recovered, and many claimed that she was getting better. But Frank soon banned them from seeing her without explanation. 5 days after the incident, Sharon died from her injuries. But many were suspicious of Frank's strange action. Especially, Sharon seems to be recovering before suddenly dying, and the doctor was also suspicious. He noticed on her body he classified her death as a homicide, and even said that the lead injury that killed Sharon may not have been caused by a vehicle, though no one could prove that Frank had been the one to run over Sharon, or that he had possibly killed her while in the hospital. Many people came to the same conclusion, especially when her friends had been the one to pay for her headstone rather than Frank. Frank soon contacted a life insurance company to claim the $80,000 policy he had taken out on Sharon only a few months prior to her death. The problem was that Frank frequently used aliases, and so the social security number he provided never matched his name. After a few tries, he finally provided his real name, Frank Delano Floyd. It was then that all of Frank's lies began to unravel. It turned out that he had quite the criminal history. When Frank was 90 in 1962, he was convicted of abducting and assaulting a 4-year-old girl, which resulted in him being sentenced to serve 10 to 20 years in prison. However, he escaped the mental hospital, where he was first placed by stealing a vehicle. Frank's shocking story was only beginning, as the day after he escaped, he robbed a bank and was subsequently captured again. In 1972, Frank was released, but almost immediately he tried to abduct a woman from a gas station and was once again arrested. This time, however, he paid his bail but kept his court date. A federal warrant was issued for his arrest, but he quickly vanished and began to use fake name while on the run. That is until he finally had to give his real full name to the life insurance company. Frank attempted to flee from authorities, but he was soon captured in Georgia and placed in prison to finish his sentence. For the friends of Sharon, they felt that Frank's arrest was a way to serve justice to her untimely death. During this time, Frank had reportedly given Michael to social media service before he went on the run, and Michael was soon put into the foster care system where he was placed with a loving family. However, everyone was shocked by the little boy's behavior, as he appeared to be nonverbal and what only screams and moaned to communicate. Frank insisted he was Michael's father, and so the child was frequently brought to visit him while in prison. When Michael showed his hesitant to visit Frank, a DNA test was eventually performed. Even though Frank initially resisted, it was discovered that despite what Frank said, Michael was not a biological child and the visits were stopped. But the shocking story doesn't end here, and it was far from over. When Frank was finally released from prison in September of 1994 after serving 4 years, he started searching Michael and his foster parent in Oklahoma. He knew he would never be given custody of the child, and so he devised a plan to take him. On September 12, 1994, Frank showed up at Michael Elementary School and demanded to see the principal, James Davis. When he wasn't allowed to take Michael, Frank pulled out a gun and threatened Davis. Michael was finally collected, all without alerting anyone at school, and Frank forced the principal under gunpoint to take the two of them to to an area a few miles from the school ground. There, Frank tied Davis to a tree, leaving him unarmed, and fled with Michael in Davis' truck. When the abduction was finally known, a frantic search began. It would take 2 long months for anything to be discovered. Frank was found in Louisville, Kentucky, and arrested, but there was no sign of Michael. Even after existing searches, there was no trace of what had happened to the little boy, and Frank refused to tell anyone. Talking about Michael to the police, Frank stated, "It is none of your business where he is. Do I care how much any of you in Oklahoma miss him or love him?" The first of many twists were revealed during Frank's trial for kidnapping Michael. In 1995, skeletal remains were found covered in Pinellas County, Florida. The remains weren't immediately identified, but an investigation determined that the victim had died from a beating and 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Later that year, a mechanic in Kansas purchased a truck at an auction, and inside he found a large envelope filled with photographs depicting a woman who had been beaten and wounded. The truck had once been in the possession of Frank Floyd, who had stolen it while he was passing through the area in 1994, before eventually abandoning it. The photos were compared to the unidentified remains, and the one to be photographed woman checked on match 1 on the recovered skull. The skeletal was soon named as belonging to Cheryl Commesso. Frank was convicted for kidnapping Michael, who still hadn't been found, but was classified as missing, and he was consequently sentenced to 50 years in prison. He then went on trial for a murder of Cheryl, where he was found guilty and sentenced to the death penalty. But the photos uncovered in the truck revealed something else, even more shocking, bringing to light another twist in this case. The picture also showed Frank assaulting a young girl, but these images were much older than the one of the child. A search began to find the identity of the girl. This is where the case took an alarming turn. It wasn't until 2014 that Sharon's true identity was officially uncovered. To find the truth about Sharon and the pictures, we have to go back after being released from prison. And while he was on the run for attempted abduction, Frank married in the mid-1970s to Sandy Chipman. At the time he had used to alias Brandon William, Sandy hadn't known who he really was. The marriage was far from romantic, especially as it had begun with them tying the knot at a truck stop. Sandy had 4 kids at the time, and she herself didn't have the cleanest record. She left her kids in Frank's care when she had to spend 30 days in jail after being caught passing bar check. When Sandy was finally released from prison, she found that her house was empty and her children's gone. It appeared that Frank had taken them and moved. It took Sandy years to figure out where her children had ended up, but she eventually found 2 of her daughters, Allison and Amy, living with a social service group. Despite this, Sandy couldn't locate her oldest daughter, Susan, or her son, Philip. Her son was eventually found when, as a grown man, Philip came forward and had a DNA test to reveal that they were related. Frank had put him up for adoption. But what happened to Sandy? Oldest daughter is even more shocking. Sharon Marshall's real name was Susan Maria Sevarkis, and she was the daughter of Sandy Chipman. In a truly alarming twist, Frank had taken Sandy's children and split them up over different social services, but raised Susan as his own daughter. Frank and Susan moved frequently and across several different states. Frank told many different stories to those around him about how he had come to care for the young girl, but in most he claimed to have rescued her when she was abandoned by her parents. At this time, he was calling her by the alias of Tanya Hughes. Yet by the time that the young girl graduated from high school, she was going by the name of Sharon Marshall. It turns out that Sharon was kidnapped as a child by Frank, her own stepfather, who raised her, frequently assaulted her, later married her when she was an adult, possibly killed her, and then kidnapped her child after she died. It was a twist that investigators found too unbelievable to be real, and yet it was true. Also revealed in 2040, she was that after almost 20 years of lies, Frank finally admitted to what many had suspected by this time, that had murdered Michael by shooting him while on the run. He had hidden his body along Interstate 35, but an intensive search didn't reveal anything. It was later concluded that Michael's body may have been eaten by wild dogs in the area. Frank Floyd was never found guilty of Sharon's murder. Through popular consensus, belief he is also guilty of this crime. To this day, he refuses to talk about Sharon's death. Frank is still awaiting his penalty for childish murder on death row.